I grew up always knowing that I would leave. The first time I moved, it was just a few hours north in Ontario. The next, to a tiny cottage on a river in Quebec. It was my first taste of real wilderness, and I loved it, but I wanted even more. We road tripped across Canada to another tiny home in British Columbia. From there to the rainforests of Australia. I was searching for something, I just didn't know what. Back to Canada, to an even more wild place, and on again to another cabin in the mountains. Each place, I was still searching. I met my husband and moved to Sweden, but that wasn't it either. We moved to Denmark and bought a cottage by the sea, but after the wild, beautiful landscapes I had lived in, Denmark didn't stand a chance. We had a house, but I was still searching for somewhere that actually felt like home.
Come on, sweetie. Come on, let's go. Hi. Are you excited? You excited? Come on, let's go.
The pandemic happened, and we found ourselves buying a camper so that we could adventure somewhere closer to Denmark. I became obsessed with the idea of Norway, as I always do with new ideas. I researched, marked down all the places that we'd go, like rest stops and hikes, and we headed out on the road. At the time, I thought it was just another place to go, another adventure to tick off my list. I've been so used to needing constant change, always wanting to move and experience new things. But what I wasn't expecting when we arrived in Norway was to feel like I'd come home for the first time in my life. I've spent years searching, not really even knowing what for, and as corny as it might sound, when we drove through this incredible landscape, I knew I'd found what I'd been searching for. And here we are again, a year after our first trip to Norway. We're back in our camper, living and working from the road in the most stunning scenery I've ever seen.
Pepsi. You ready to fill up the water?
Let's go. Come on. Izzy, come on. Let's go down to the water.
Oh.
Catch me falling in.
No. You won't fall in. I believe in you.
So what's going on? Is it for both of us?
Tonight it is. Don't get used to this. This is not a normal thing.
Uh-oh.
Just in the camper. We're making Mexican bowls, which have absolutely nothing to do with Mexican food at all. It is some bastardized version of Mexican food that I'm making. But I think it's going to be good.
I hope so.
I hope so too. That's all we have.
That's a lot of rice.
It is, but...
Are you sure that's what you want to do?
Everything's fine, don't worry. Everything's fine, just take the camera away. I promise, I'm running on this just fine. Evening starts to fall over the river at our campsite. We know that this is likely one of the only clear, warm days we'll have here in Norway, so we make the most out of it by chopping the veggies for our dinner outside on the picnic table and eating outdoors by the last bits of daylight. We collect some wood and make a fire in the fire pit as the stars start to peek out, and it turns into such a cozy night. Being on the road doesn't come without challenges. My mind is a constant battle between the ADHD urge to be on the move and throw caution to the wind, and my autism's need for rigidity, structure, and routine. I love being out here. I love the new experiences that living a simple life on the road brings, but since I received my diagnosis a couple months ago, at least I now understand why I can be happy and also really struggling at the same time. Every few days brings us to a new location, and we're setting back into the rhythm of being on the road. Before we left home this time, I spent months going through hundreds, if not thousands, of rest stops in Norway, viewing each one on Google Street View and rating them as emergency, overnight, or long-term stays. Needless to say, we're really prepared this time, and we can easily go with the flow because we know what to expect and have multiple backup options for rest stops if one doesn't end up working out. It gives us a lot more flexibility and puts my mind at ease. We head out again on what I think is one of the most beautiful drives I've ever seen in Norway. It's from Bjorli to Endalsnes. We leave the Alpine and slowly the mountains start to rise around us until we're fully surrounded by Romsdalsalpen. The mountains are stunning and they completely dwarf everything around us. It's a humbling feeling to feel so tiny, so insignificant in this wild landscape. And inevitably, as it always does in Norway, the rain begins. It turns the landscape from being merely beautiful to almost mystical and eerie. One thing that really helps me out here, especially when it's raining a lot like it is right now, is to take CBD oil every day. It's been the one constant in my daily routine for years now. I use a brand called Premium Jane, and knowing that I can rely on their CBD to calm my anxiety is essential out here. especially now that I have my autism diagnosis, and I'm so grateful that I have the gummies and the oil to take every day. Without them, dealing with the regular change and unexpected situations out here would be pretty much impossible. Each day brings a new storm and more rain. The mystical landscape looks beautiful to start with the fog and the clouds obscuring the mountains, but if I'm being honest, it becomes tiring pretty quickly. The same routines that we always have on the road, like finding a rest stop, driving up, extending the camper legs, leveling the camper, turning on the heating, doing the dishes. For the most part, I really enjoy these routines, but they feel much less adventurous and interesting when you're soaking wet, never able to get fully dry. That's the reality of living in a camper in Norway, especially during the rainy season. We can plan and prepare as much as we want, but the weather still rules this wild landscape. So we change our plan and begin to drive a route that we never expected to, and to be honest, one that we weren't really prepared for. It's through the Trollstigen and one of the most beautiful routes we've taken. As frustrating as it can feel to have to change our trip due to the rain, we found that it's always worth it. And even though where we end up isn't where we thought we would, it's often better than we expected. Wow, it has been a day. We are at our next spot here in Norway, and it is sunny and beautiful out right now, which I really appreciate because for the past few days it has been pouring rain. We really lucked out last year when we were in Norway because we had kind of on and off rain, but nothing consistent, and we thought, wow, if this is rainy Norway, then we are lucky. This is beautiful and we can live out in our camper no problem at all. This year, that's not really what's happened. We decided this year, because last year we got stuck in a snowstorm, so we decided to kind of flip our trip on its head, and we decided to go north earlier in the season so we could try to avoid the bad weather that comes in October. But we didn't really look at the long range forecast, and because of that, once we got north, we had no idea that we were going to run into rainstorm after rainstorm, and for the past 3 days, it has just been pouring rain. Everything is wet. All of our towels, our shoes, our clothing, and rain is really cozy. It's really hygge when you're in a cozy cabin and you've got a wood stove and you can dry everything off. And even though we have a heater in this camper and we're pretty well outfitted, we just can't get everything dry. It is so hard to get everything dry when it's constantly raining and we have our dog Pepsi and we want to be outside here in Norway. We want to go out for hikes and see the beautiful nature. That's the entire reason that we're here. So we quickly realized that we just couldn't stay north because we looked at the forecast and it was just storm after storm coming through. And we realized that if we wanted to get back to better weather, we needed to go quite far south from where we were. So that led to today where we drove 7 hours and we have finally arrived at our next location. It is gorgeous. The sun is setting over the fjord. It's absolutely beautiful. And I'm so glad to be back in better weather. You know, it really makes you appreciate what we have out here. I mean, I'm not complaining at all. I know that we go out into Norway in the rainiest month of the year, so we have to expect a certain amount of bad weather, but I'm just so glad that the sun is shining again. Makes me really grateful for it. We end up in an area that we had never planned on visiting this trip, Sonnefjord, and I fall completely in love with it. Right behind our campsite, there's a steep hike up the mountain, and each afternoon we venture out and climb to the top. Since the sun is starting to set earlier with each day that goes on, we try to get outside while there's still plenty of daylight and try to watch the sunset. The path snakes through the rocky forest until it reaches the top with an amazing view over the fjord and the surrounding mountains. While we're here, we make a last-minute decision to view a cabin that's for sale, and a little spoiler, we fall in love with that too. A few days later, we move on again to a cozy spot on a river. It looks just like where I used to live in Canada. It's the perfect night where we have nowhere to go and nothing to do, so we cook up a hearty lentil stew filled with veggies and serve it over rice. One-pot meals like this are perfect for when we have a small space to cook in, and lentil stew is especially cozy on a rainy night like tonight.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You ready?
I'm ready. Have you tried this?
I haven't. Do you use it as a spice?
Yeah. It's really nice.
I thought you were just using it for cooking.
No, I was using it for cooking and as a topping.
Try it.
We also made a few upgrades to our camper this year, and one of them was installing a TV screen so that we could easily watch movies when we have a night in, just like tonight. The weather starts to turn colder, and every few hours we're checking the map on Windy to see when it's supposed to snow. Last year, we got caught in a snowstorm, and even though we thankfully have winter tires on our car this year, we're trying our best to avoid the snow coming down from the glacier that's just north of us. At this point, even though we want to, we can't really plan beyond the next day or two because the snow map is changing daily. It becomes kind of like a game of cat and mouse, where the snow almost catches us each time, but we manage to evade it. We plan our next stop on a lake in the Alpine, but after hours of driving, we arrive to find a no camping sign. So, as we often have to out here, we recalibrate and come up with a new plan. It involves driving almost all the way up into the Alpine, but we cross our fingers and hope we'll avoid the snow once more. The new location ends up being gorgeous, a little turnoff in front of a lake surrounded by hiking trails. Because we've been on the move so frequently on this trip, and much more than we expected to, we haven't gotten to go hiking nearly as much as I want to. So, since we're lucky enough to have another sunny day, we prioritize finding a trail and head out onto it. It's one of my favorite activities, and my dream one day is to complete a long through hike. It's not happening anytime soon, but for now, at least we can hike up into the mountains close to our camp spot. Because it's been raining so much, the ground is really soggy, but I'm just so happy to be out hiking that I don't really mind. We climb up through a valley that leads us to the Alpine. It's so barren up here. It looks like a completely different world. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it's like stepping into the set of Lord of the Rings. We have a panoramic view of the stunning rocky landscape, and I could just explore here for hours. The incoming snowstorms have us on the move again, so we leave our little spot by the lake and drive southeast to our land. Last year, when we were in Norway, we drove through the most towering mountains I think we've ever seen, past a rest stop that we knew we had to camp at this time around. So we begin the long journey through winding roads and take a ferry along the way. There's another reason we're heading to this spot, because it's only an hour away from the cabin that we've fallen in love with, and we need to see it again before we decide whether we want to put in an offer. We pull up and have our usual routine of stabilizing the camper, only this time we realize that I've forgotten our tire stabilizer at our last rest stop, so we have to improvise and park the camper up on a ledge. So I'm not in Norway anymore. Obviously it's winter and it's taken me a long time to make this video. I wasn't even sure that I was going to explain why it's taken me so long, but the truth is it's a part of my story and it's a part of my experience, so it's something that I wanted to share. And ever since the first trip that we took to Norway, I knew that I wanted to buy a cabin there. And ever since that first trip, even on the first trip, we started casually looking with no intention of buying right away because the prices have been jacked up due to COVID and the war. So we have been just casually looking with no intention of actually getting one right now, but just hoping that maybe we could learn something about the process. And this trip, I decided to find a few cabins in the areas that we were in, just to take a look. And because we had been rerouted to an area, to Sogndalsfjord, and we hadn't expected to be there, I thought, oh, I'll just look at some cabins and see if there's anything we can go take a look at. And I found something that on paper looked like the perfect cabin. And I started to get my hopes up because it was within our price range. It was everything that we wanted. And because we are not married to the idea of being in one specific area of Norway, we are completely open to having a cabin virtually anywhere within like a 10-hour circle. We love a lot of different areas. Because of that, when we actually find one that we like, we have to go through this whole process of visualizing everything and researching every little bit that we can find about that cabin and about the area, so that we can really know whether this is a place that we want to spend half of our year in. So we have to look up every little detail you can imagine that you'd think of when you have to move to a new location, and decide at that moment, okay, is this the place we want to have a cabin in? So we had to do that process for this cabin, and I fell in love with the area. And even though I knew I should have managed my expectations and maybe not gotten my hopes up, that's not so easy for me to do, just having a neurodivergent brain, and I really got invested to the idea of this cabin. So our days were filled with viewings, and then we started the process with paperwork. Obviously, I'm not Norwegian, so it's an entirely different process for me. And we ended up putting an offer on the cabin, and it was declined. So we put in another offer, and that offer was declined. And I was completely heartbroken. The owner of this cabin was still hoping to get way more than the cabin was worth, and it's not realistic. It's still for sale, actually. He hasn't sold this cabin, even though it's months and months later. But in the end, now, objectively looking back, I can say that I'm really happy we didn't get the cabin, because there was a lot of things that I chose to overlook because I was so in love with the area. It just had these incredible expansive views of the mountains. It was near the Alpine. It had a view of a river and a waterfall, and I was just so blown away that this perfect cabin existed for us, or this nearly perfect cabin. And at the time, I was grieving for a long time, actually. I can now objectively look back and say, yeah, I'm really glad we didn't get this cabin. I know we're gonna find one that's even better, that's even more suited to what we want, but it has taken me months to get to this point. And I had to go through that whole process of letting go of that dream, at least temporarily, and that can take me a long time. So that's where we are now. We're definitely gonna go back to look at more cabins in the future, but right now it's just so cool to think of the fact that the cabin we're gonna buy is currently out there and someone is thinking of selling it right now. That is such a cool thought.
It's our last 2 nights in Norway, and it might just end up being the most memorable part of our trip. We've been watching the Aurora app since we first set our camper up on the glacier lake near Kvam, our first stop along this adventure. That night, sitting by the campfire, we saw the northern lights for the first time through the clouds. And I've been checking the KP rating and trying to understand the patterns and the signs, hoping that we'll see the aurora again. It becomes a fixation for me, and so many of our nights in our camper have been spent setting up our camping chairs, carrying out our duvets, bundling up in our warmest clothing, and sitting out under the stars, hoping each time that this would be the night we see the northern lights dance across the sky. But even after so many nights of high KP ratings and predictions that tonight would finally be the night, we've seen no hint of the Lady Aurora. Tonight is another night of hoping. The predictions are high, and it's saying that we have up to a 20% chance of seeing the night sky light up. So we do the same routine over again, set up the camera, and enjoy the beautiful sunset over the river, hoping as the sun goes down that our trip in Norway will end with something that I've been dreaming about for years. And just as it starts to get dark outside, we see our first glimpse of what could be the Northern Lights. I can't imagine a better end to our time in the place that feels so much like home.